Welcome to A Way Forward, the right to recover.
Welcome to A Way Forward, the right to recover with attorney Richard Casey III, partner at Robinson and Casey PLLC. Richard focuses on helping families navigate legal options when addiction or serious mental illness creates an urgent safety concern. His work includes the Marchman Act cases, mental health guardianship, and advocacy around the treatment access and oversight. I'm Lisa Mosbey, and today we're talking about what can happen if someone does not show up to court during a Marchman Act case and how that affects the legal process. Welcome, Richard. Thanks for joining me for this topic.
Thank you for having me, Lisa.
Richard, this is a hard topic for families to address because a person is in distress when this comes into play. When a Marchman Act hearing is scheduled, what is expected of the person at the center of the case in terms of appearing in court?
So it obviously would be very concerning to a family if their loved one didn't appear at the time of the scheduled hearing. Fortunately, this is not something that happens often. One of the requirements at the beginning of any proceeding is to get official service on the individuals. So when we file a Marchman Act proceeding, we get a court date. We're certain to work with law enforcement or a private process server to coordinate in getting that person served with the paperwork. And when they receive that paperwork, they'll know of the date and time of that hearing. Obviously, if we're not aware of the patient is at a particular time, we'll be continuing to work with the family to find their location, so that we know where they're located and then we can get them served. That's probably the most common way that someone doesn't show to the hearing, is that the family and us are working with potentially private investigators, private process servers to identify their location. And again, that doesn't happen often. Normally, when we're starting these cases, we're preparing for this. We're not letting the patient know, or the respondent in the legal case know, that we'll be looking for them for service, and service is the first time they'll become aware of it. At that point in time, the jurisdiction, the power of the court attaches to the patient, to the respondent, for legal purposes, and they're required to appear at the date and time. Most counties will allow the court case to proceed whether they show up or not, so long as you can prove that service was gathered. Occasionally, they might give a continuance for a week to see if they'll return. They may work with their attorney to see if they can get them on the phone to talk to or collaborate with why they aren't present, whether they could get on a Zoom call to join the court hearing virtually at that point in time. But more often than not, as long as we have official service of process on the patient, at the point in time that the hearing is scheduled, they had been made aware to be there, the court will proceed with the case, because they had what we call notice and an opportunity to be heard. And so they were given notice with service, and the hearing date and time was their opportunity. And so whether they show or not, the family has the opportunity to continue moving forward.
And I know this is a silly question, but does it impact the outcome of the case if they don't show up, or of the hearing?
Well, like I said, there's always the possibility that the court wants to give them an additional time to appear. Maybe there was a reason they didn't show. Maybe they are able to get on the Zoom proceeding and indicate that there was something that prevented them that's legitimate, or at least the court can't prove is illegitimate. And so it may cause a continuance. And that would be one of the things families usually like the least, but is not negatively determinative, right? It doesn't determine the outcome one way or the other. It just means that we have to wait more, and that's something the families normally don't like. So we try to avoid that as best we can, but it's not always unavoidable. Absent that, the case should still proceed in the normal course, and we should be able to get the normal outcome of whatever that hearing was for.
And then are there situations where the court may issue a pickup order or take additional action when somebody fails to appear?
Certainly, I mean, I think it depends on what the nature of the hearing is for. And so if the hearing
Okay.
was for a motion to show cause, which is a fancy legal term for holding somebody in contempt or holding them accountable for not following a prior court order, um, and then they also fail to appear, then the court may use its powers to have a police pickup order granted. Similarly, at a treatment services hearing for a Marchman Act, if the outcome of that hearing is that they will be required to enter into and submit to treatment services and they weren't at the hearing, the court may then authorize law enforcement to transport them to that treatment experience. So the Marchman Act has some unique opportunities that other court hearings may not have, where law enforcement can be authorized to do a transport from the respondent's location to the treatment facility.
So it sounds like it's just a tool that's available to the court system. Are there other things that can be used for compliance in a Marchman case?
Like I said earlier, there's this proceeding called a motion to show cause, and that's one of the main tools for compliance. So we would file this
Okay.
proceeding if there was any violation of a prior order, whether it be an order to get an assessment completed, an order to be in treatment, and that allows the court to determine, did this person knowingly and willingly violate its court order? And then it can put consequences in place. Usually those would be picked up and brought to jail so that they can come back to court and determine whether or not they're willing to resubmit to the court order. The period of 90 days could restart. There are other consequences the court may um, think of for the purposes of persuading the patient back into treatment.
And what role does the family member or family members play in that moment when the person does not appear?
So obviously, the family is usually anxious if there's a situation where a patient doesn't appear. Normally, they've probably been prepped by the attorneys in advance of that hearing with what exactly is necessary under their particular case. So if they've run away from treatment under a court order and we're not expecting them to come to the motion to show cause hearing that was set up, then we would probably have had that conversation with the family. And so their role really leads more up to the hearing, which is, are you in contact with the patient? Can you make sure they're aware of the hearing date and time? Can we make sure that we get them, into the hearing? Can we try to help them understand the consequences could be just as bad if they don't appear and have a better chance of having more lenient consequences if they do come? So the family kind of plays a big role kind of in advance of helping us kind of navigate what their options are in communication with their loved one. Um, but at the hearing, primarily they would be just there to testify to anything that they knew specifically about their non-compliance or their situation, their use of substances, and they would really just be encouraged to seek that additional support they may get from clinical team members that are working with them, because I know it's a really anxiety-provoking moment for them.
And I see the Marchman Act as, it's for compassion. It's to get somebody help who needs it. Um, maybe I use the word compliance and that might be the wrong word because the idea is not necessarily to force someone. We want them to take charge. We want them to get help. So when they don't show, how do people get a handle on this? How do families, because they want their loved one to get help. Do you have any thoughts about that from your experience? How they help with getting their loved one to show up?
Obviously, showing up to treatment is more important than showing up to the hearing, right? And
Sure. Right.
and
Yep.
one of the biggest things, pardon, and one of the biggest things about getting the patient to enter into treatment, nobody wants to force their loved one to go to treatment, but often the
No.
scenario is the the Marchman Act is not the only way families are trying to force their loved one into treatment, right? Almost every patient who's going to treatment is being forced in some way or another. The family are using coercive mechanisms like
Mm.
cutting off financial funding and support, right? Ultimately making ultimatums around what they would do in their relationship status, all in order to help that patient recognize for themselves their need to take responsibility. The Marchman Act is for when there isn't an additional type of leverage that is working to keep that patient engaged in treatment. So they're not willing to enter into and stay in treatment without some type of leverage. So even though the ultimate goal is for the patient to take self-responsibility. Having pressure and forcing a patient to treatment is a very normal and natural process of getting someone started on their recovery journey. So the family really still needs to hold boundaries. They still need to use the leverages that they do have. They do need to use those boundaries and leverages to help them get to court. Often, that's an opportunity for a third party who might become a neutral uh, arbiter of, I guess, fact, right? So what the patient might hear is less mom being upset again and more a judge talking about how their substance use is actually a problem objectively. And so it's this objective, neutral voice saying the exact same thing, and it can resonate differently, right? It doesn't look like they're hired, it doesn't look like they're mom. It's something where this person is there listening to everything that's going on and saying, this is what's appropriate and necessary. And so it actually moves it back into this neutral category, which can be really helpful in the psyche of the patient, making those acceptances into treatment. But I would say that really most people are being forced into treatment from their perspective when they go in, regardless of being Marchman Acted or not, right? I mean, I went to treatment. My family certainly forced me, even though I didn't have a Marchman Act on me. Um, it was definitely a lot of pressure, and until the ratchet was turned so the heat was up high enough, right? I wasn't willing to make those changes. And similarly, I'm an adult child of my father who died from alcoholism, and I've been in the room and I certainly put pressure on forced my dad to treatment. It's probably a bigger catalyst of why I do what I do to help families is that I've been a 21-year-old kid sitting in an intervention with my dad's business colleagues, my mom and my sister, and he just kept saying he wasn't going to treatment, and I was one of the last people to go. And ultimately, I had to just tell him I would never speak to him again if he didn't go to treatment. If that's not forcing or trying your best to force someone to treatment, I really don't know what is. And I meant it. Like, and it was probably, it's probably the saddest thing I ever had to do in my life. And it was still the decision that allowed me to have several months of a sober father that I hadn't had in years. Ultimately, I think we acted too late. I think that we didn't act strong enough, and I don't think that we had the right tool to keep him in treatment beyond like 6 weeks. And so he didn't survive, but it was the type of forcing him that let me actually have a conversation with my dad again.
And thank you for sharing that description because it helps put it in perspective for me on how it helps motivate someone and to show them the seriousness of their behavior in a neutral way, but yet with some consequences and pressure. How can a missed court appearance change the direction of a timeline of the Marchman Act? Because these usually run for a set period of time.
Yeah, so again, I think that particularly in the concept of a motion to show cause, a case is already part of the way through.
Mhm.
So each Marchman
Okay.
Act order for treatment services is going to be for up to 90 days. That's the window. And at the end of the 90-day period, you can come back to court and ask for it to be renewed. If a patient doesn't appear at a hearing, it depends on what that hearing is for. But if the hearing is for a motion to show cause, and say that's 45 days into the 90-day order, one of the things the court could use as a consequence is to restart the 90-day window. Thus, they would lose the credit for the 45 days they were behaving, right? And ultimately have to start anew to say, hey, treatment was for up to 90 days, not for 45 and then take a week break and then go back for 45, right? It's up to 90. So we're going to restart the clock, and you can see if you can stay consecutively inside of a treatment program for the period of time that you need. So one of the consequences of not showing really can just be restarting that clock, and it really helps drive the behavior of I should go to treatment, I should stay engaged, I shouldn't leave, and I should obey the court's orders because I don't want to have to keep going through the same cycle. if I'm already putting some time and effort into getting better. So it's actually a really helpful tool, and a really helpful consequence because it's nothing more than encouraging treatment.
Richard, do you have any final thoughts on things you'd like to share with our audience today?
I think that, having shared a little bit about my personal story, I think it's really important for families to kind of, you know, um, know that they're not alone in this kind of internal struggle to figure out how much is too much. Like the risk really comes down to, am I going to lose the relationship with my loved one over holding too strong of a boundary? Like, what if this backfires? Like, I was 21. I wasn't in charge of setting up this intervention. I didn't really want to be at the intervention. I just wanted a sober dad, and I didn't want to have to be the one to do it. Like, I didn't know what to do, how to do it, and I was really still a kid. And I don't care if you're 45, if you're 65, if you're 85. If you've got a loved one suffering from addiction, you probably don't want to have to be the one that says, I will never speak to you again unless you do the things you have to do. Because what if they call your bluff? Then they know it's a bluff and they'll never get sober. Or you have to stick to your guns and you may never speak to them again. Like, it's a shit position. Excuse my language. And so, but I think it's the right choice, because if you're not willing to stake it all, why should they? And if you're not willing to say, this is the end of the line, I won't change. These are the things that I require in order to have a relationship with you, then, like, how can, and I'm not saying it's all or nothing, but it is like, I'll support treatment, I'll support medical care, but I'm not going to act like everything's okay, right? When you continue to hurt yourself on a daily basis by using drugs and alcohol.
It's when you don't stand up and do something and it becomes fatal, then the guilt is overwhelming. And so where do you draw the line? I'd rather have my dad living and me not speaking to him until he gets help than not having the opportunity to ever connect or ever have that relationship. So it's a tough spot to be in. And I'm glad that we have people like you who are compassionate, who've been there, who know how to walk the family through these challenging times and what tools are available. So I want to thank you for walking me through this process today. I appreciate your insights.
Thank you.
That's it for today's episode of A Way Forward, The Right to Recover. If you'd like to learn more about Richard Casey and the work of Robinson Casey PLLC, including resources related to the Marchman Act in Florida, visit robinsoncasey.com. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a review if you found this episode helpful. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.